Today we'll finish our reading of Book 5 of the Ethics. There are about 10 propositions left. They're primarily concerned with what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, which term he introduces after proposition 32. The proposition states, whatsoever we understand by the third kind of knowledge, we take delight in, and our delight is accompanied by the idea of God as cause. And he cites the proposition 27, which we saw last day, which states that from this kind of knowledge arises the highest possible mental acquiescence, that is pleasure. So this is the pleasure of understanding. Remember that for Spinoza, emotion and reason are two sides of the same coin. You can't think yourself out of an emotion, but you need to overcome an emotion, you need another emotion. So emotions are like ideas that have force or impetus, so that one idea can overcome another if its effective content is sufficiently powerful. And for Spinoza, the most powerful emotion, the most pleasurable emotion, the emotion which is capable of ruling over all of the other emotions, is the knowledge of the third kind under its effective aspect. Okay, and this is what he calls the intellectual love of God. Love of God because it's pleasure with the idea of God as a cause, and intellectual because it involves the power of reason, knowledge of the third kind being the supreme class of reason. The intellectual love of God, which arises from the third kind of knowledge, is eternal because the third kind of knowledge is the insight into the necessary existence of things, which is to say their eternity. And he explains in the Scholium that rather than use the term pleasure in this context, he will use the term blessedness instead, stating that since his definition of pleasure involved a transition from a lesser to a greater degree of perfection, from a lesser degree of activity to a greater degree of activity, and blessedness is perfection itself. He says it's more appropriate to use the term blessedness than love or pleasure in this context. Proposition 34 says that the mind, only while the body endures, is subject to those emotions which are attributable to passions. This is just a direct consequence of the proposition we saw last day, to the effect that the powers of imagination and memory, being dependent on the way the body is affected by bodies external to itself, that these powers only endure as long as the body endures. And he uses this to draw a corollary that no love save the intellectual love is eternal. And in the Scholium, he reiterates an idea that we saw before, that we have an intuition of our eternity, but misunderstand it, confuse it with immortality, because we confuse eternity with indefinite duration, whereas for Spinoza, eternity means necessary existence, which is to say, existence necessitated by the divine nature. Proposition 35 states that God loves himself with an infinite intellectual love. And in the proof, he says that he actually anthropomorphizes God to some extent. He says that God being absolutely perfect, the nature of God rejoices in infinite perfection. And such rejoicing is accompanied by the idea of himself, that is, the idea of his own cause. So Spinoza has certainly talked about the idea of God before, or God's idea of himself, that is also known as the infinite intellect of God. It's the immediate infinite mode under the attribute of extension. But this, to date, has appeared to be completely impersonal. There is no suggestion, as far as I know, in the earlier parts of the Ethics that Spinoza's God is conscious of himself in the way that the Abrahamic God is traditionally thought of as being. Spinoza's God to date has been entirely impersonal, although clearly this does not prevent Spinoza from having an intimate relation with God or with reality or with life. But he clearly uses anthropomorphic language here because he's going to go on and lay it on with a trowel now in Proposition 36. The intellectual love of the mind towards God is that very love of God whereby God loves himself. Not insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as he can be explained through the essence of the human mind, regarded under the form of eternity. In other words, the intellectual love of the mind towards God is part of the infinite love wherewith God loves himself. There is, for Spinoza, no separation between God and the eternal part of the mind, the part of the mind that consists of ideas which are adequate in God. Hence it follows that the corollary states, hence it follows that God, insofar as he loves himself, loves man, and consequently that the love of God towards men and the intellectual love of the mind towards God are identical. So Spinoza has rescued a version of the idea that not only does man love God, but God loves man. And in the Scholium, he states that from what has been said, we clearly understand wherein our salvation or blessedness or freedom lies, namely in the constant and eternal love towards God, or in God's love towards men. And he says this love or blessedness is in the Bible called glory. I believe that the Hebrew term here is Shekinah. For whether this love be referred to God or to the mind, it may rightly be called acquiescence of spirit. So this, when he talks about acquiescence, he includes in that both acquiescence to reality and acquiescence to ourselves, whether this love be referred to God or to the mind. It becomes clear to us in what manner and way our mind, as to its essence and existence, follows from the divine nature and consequently depends on God. And he now goes on to explain why this insight depends on the third kind of knowledge rather than the second. The knowledge of particular things, which I've called intuitive or of the third kind. Okay, this example shows how much more powerful it is than the universal knowledge, which I have styled knowledge of the second kind, which is to say, reason. He says that the demonstrations in part one, though legitimate and placed beyond the chances of doubt, do not affect our mind so much as when the same conclusion is derived from the actual essence of some particular thing, in this case, the essence of the mind, which we say depends on God. Reason for Spinoza, he says that it's knowledge which derives from common notions and adequate ideas about the properties of things, the properties that they share with other things, and deductions from these common notions. But it's clear that it can't get at the essence of particular things because it's only concerned with the properties that things share in common with other things. And in particular, the essence of the human mind is something, because it's personal and accessible only to us, is inaccessible to the knowledge of the second kind, the understanding of the eternity of the human mind, that it is in God and necessitated by God, for Spinoza, can only come from the third kind of knowledge, and the effective aspect of this third kind of knowledge is the intellectual love of God. Proposition 38 states that there is nothing in nature which is contrary to this intellectual love or which can take it away, because God is all-encompassing. He refers in the Scholium to the axiom in part 4, which said that for any particular thing, there is another thing which is more powerful than it and which can overcome it. This doesn't apply, he says, to the intellectual love of God, because that axiom refers to things understood as being conditioned by circumstances of time and place, rather than things as understood to be eternal. Proposition 38 says, in proportion as the mind understands more things by the second and third kind of knowledge, it is less subject to those emotions which are evil and stands less in fear of death. In this proof, he identifies the eternal part of the mind with the part that consists of adequate ideas, which are known through the second and third kind of knowledge, as distinct from the first kind of knowledge, imagination, which is the source of our passive emotions, including fear of death. And he reiterates in the Scholium that from the third kind of knowledge arises the highest possible acquiescence. It follows that the human mind can attain to being of such a nature that the part thereof which we have shown to perish with the body should be of little importance when compared with the part that endures. Proposition 39 reiterates his dual aspect monism of mind and body. He who possesses a body capable of the greatest number of activities possesses a mind whereof the greatest part is eternal. I think the most interesting aspect of this proposition is in the scholium from this point on, where he states that um, he talks about the developmental arc as a child grows from infancy to um, adulthood and increases in the power of activity, how the child early in life is scarcely conscious of itself or of God or of things, whereas he who has a body who is capable of very many activities has a mind which, considered in itself alone, is highly conscious of itself, of God, and of things. In this life, therefore, we primarily endeavor to bring it about that the body of a child, insofar as its nature allows and conduces thereto, may be changed into something else capable of very many activities and referable to a mind which is highly conscious of itself and of God and of things. So I think this is interesting because now that Spinoza has veered into frankly religious language, salvation, blessedness, and so forth, it's interesting to ask how Spinoza's conception here might be might be compared with ideas of liberation as they appear in other religions. And for Spinoza, it doesn't appear to be a binary state, a final destination which, once arrived at, um, results in a static state of affairs. It's a developmental process. The intellectual love of God is something that it's an attainment which increases over the course of the lifespan. Proposition 40 just reiterates this idea: in proportion as each thing possesses more of perfection, so it is more active and less passive, and vice versa. In proportion as it is more active, so it is more perfect. And of course, this perfection, this activity for Spinoza is the intellectual activity, the power of understanding. So he reiterates in the Scholium, for the eternal part of the mind is the understanding through which alone we are said to act. The part which you have shown to perish is the imagination through which only we are said to be passive. So in the Scholium, he now says that he's come to the end of the sequence of propositions, which began with proposition 20 concerning the duration of the mind independently of the body. And he concludes by saying that it is plain that our mind, insofar as it understands, is an eternal mode of thinking, which is determined by another eternal mode of thinking, and this other by a third, and so on to infinity. So that all taken together at once constitute the eternal and infinite intellect of God. So he is referring here to proposition 28 in book one, uh, where uh, he describes the mind as part of an infinite causal chain. Causal determinism for Spinoza governs the mind just as much as it does physical nature, and it's entirely deterministic. This liberation that he is talking about ultimately is up to God. Okay, all that these eternal modes of thinking determine each other. Okay, and all taken together constitute the eternal and infinite intellect of God. Okay, he now is going to wind up the ethics by proposition 41 and 42. Proposition 41 says that even if we did not know our mind is eternal, we should still consider its primary importance, piety and religion, and generally all things in part, for which we showed to be attributable to courage and high-mindedness. So those were the two active emotions that he introduced at the end of part 3. Courage is the active emotion of endeavoring to persist in our own being, and high-mindedness, the active emotion which promotes friendship with other people. And what he said there still stands, independently of what he has just said about the eternity of the mind. But the interesting thing is where he contrasts this with the general belief of the multitude. And this is the idea of the immortality of the soul. He says, most people seem to believe that they are free insofar as they may obey their lusts and that they see their rights, insofar as they are bound to live according to the commandments of the divine law. They therefore believe that piety, religion, and generally all things attributable to firmness of mind are burdens which after death they hope to lay aside and to receive the reward for their bondage, that is, for their piety and religion. It is not only by this hope, but also chiefly by the fear of being horribly punished after death that they are induced to live according to the divine commandments so far as their feeble and infirm spirit will carry them. So for Spinoza, this fear of being horribly punished after death is a gross aberration. Okay, because a fear of the consequences of our activity is a fear of our own power of activity, which is a fear of our own conatus, our own existence. But he says, if men had not this hope and this fear, if they believed that the mind perishes with the body, and that no hope of prolonged life remains for the wretches who are broken down with the burden of piety, they would return to their own inclinations, controlling everything in accordance with their lusts, and desiring to obey fortune rather than themselves. So he is contrasting this popular notion of immortality of the soul with his doctrine of the eternity of the mind, and well, essentially saying that the multitude will continue to live this way with the belief that the mind is immortal but not eternal in the sense that he has outlined. This, by the way, is the only instance of the word immortal in the Ethics, and it's clearly not the same as Spinoza's idea of eternity of the mind. And the final proposition states that blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. Neither do we rejoice therein because we control our lusts, but contrariwise, because we rejoice therein, we are able to control our lusts. So rejoicing therein, this is the emotion of the intellectual love of God, which he also calls blessedness. And he reiterates again that since human power in controlling the emotion consists solely in the understanding, he says it follows that no one rejoices in blessedness because he has controlled his lusts by a putative act of will or a decree of the mind, but contrariwise, his power of controlling his lusts arises from this blessedness itself. And the final scholium says that it appears how potent is the wise man and how much he surpasses the ignorant man who is driven only by his lusts. For the ignorant man is not only distracted in various ways by external causes, he does not in fact understand what causes him to act in one way or another, without ever gaining true acquiescence of his spirit, but moreover lives, as it were, unwitting of himself and of God and of things, and as soon as he ceases to suffer, ceases also to be. Whereas the wise man, insofar as he is regarded as such, is scarcely at all disturbed in spirit, but being conscious of himself and of God and of things, by a certain eternal necessity never ceases to be, but always possesses true acquiescence of his spirit. If the way which I have pointed out as leading to this result seems exceedingly hard, it may nonetheless be discovered. Needs must it be hard, since it is so seldom found. How would it be possible if salvation were ready to our hand and could without great labor be found, that it should be by almost all men neglected? But all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. So here in the last paragraph, he is obviously echoing the New Testament formula. Straight is the gate, and narrow is the way that leadeth unto whatever salvation, and few there be that find it. The use of this religious language is obviously deliberate. Spinoza um, uses religious rhetoric to incite the imagination, to incite the endeavor or the desire to know things by the third kind of knowledge. It's clear to me, at any rate, that Spinoza believed that he actually had the goods which religious teachers promise but don't have. Okay, and that these goods are accessible through the power of the intellect. Good. That's the end of Spinoza's ethics.